Let me walk you through the concept of setting up DAS element. After you have installed the software, which will probably be on some artist's workstation, you want to load a library. In the terminology of a DAS element, a library is a collection of elements. These elements can be different files, for example a movie file, a single image or a sequence of images. You can have multiple libraries for different purposes, like an elements library, a texture library or some other library for matte painting images or references from the internet. Each library exists of two components. One is the library config, that contains the configuration of the library, like transcoding templates and value overwrites. The other one is the database. The database holds all information, like the file paths, tags and categories, for all the elements of this library. These two combined, the config file and the database, is what we understand as a library. Now, where do we define the naming convention and folder structure of a library? That will be happening in the global configuration file, that is called das-element.conf. The config file contains the global configuration of all libraries associated with this configuration. Here you can define the folder structure and naming convention that is shared across all of the linked libraries. When creating your new setup for the software, you can specify the file location. This file can be stored anywhere. The next step is to connect the artist with that global config file. Now the setup.ini file is coming into play. This file is stored locally on an artist's workstation. That file links to the global configuration file. Alright, all we are missing now are the actual elements. In most cases, these will be located on some kind of storage. You can have the elements locally if you are a single user. Or if you are a company, the files will probably be on a network storage. In this case, the best practice is to have the global config in a shared folder that all the artists have access to. Now you can create or load additional libraries if needed and link it to the global configuration file. The benefit of using one global config file is that you only have to maintain one file that is shared across all artists. Changes will affect everybody. This can be very helpful if you have to manage many artists. Let's quickly summarize what we have learned so far. The software uses a file called setup.ini to point to a global configuration file. That file manages the global settings for all the loaded libraries, like the naming convention and the folder structure. The global config file links to a library. A library is a collection of elements and is a combination of a library config file and a database. The global config can load up multiple libraries, which will all share the same global configuration. You can easily create a new global configuration for other pipeline scenarios. All you have to do is to point the setup.ini file to the other file. By default, the setup.ini file is stored in your local user home directory. Switching to another global config can be done in the user interface of the software. Or you can set an environment variable. If you want to force the creation of a new setup, simply delete the setup file. When the config file defined in the setup file is not accessible, the startup screen will appear. Now let's actually create a new setup. The first time you start the application, you will see the welcome screen. There are a few steps that you have to do before you can create an actual library. Don't worry, these steps only have to be done once if you don't already have an existing setup. Just click the arrow on the right side to get started. First, you have to define the location of the global configuration file. By default, it is saved in the user's home directory in folder called .daselement. Or you can choose some custom location. For example, somewhere on a shared folder on your server. Now you can choose a preset for the naming convention and folder structure. If you use the software for the first time, it is recommended to choose a preset and start customizing from there. Click Let's Go, and you are all set up. If you have an existing setup at your company, simply click the Load Setup button at the bottom of the screen. All that you have to do now is to navigate to the daselement.conf file and click Open. Let's create a new library. First, the software will ask you to choose a name for the library. You can choose any name. The name can be changed later on as well. The next step is to define the library root location. That is the place where all the actual files and proxies will be stored. The root location can be changed later on. All file paths of a library are saved relative to this path, so you don't have to worry that file paths will break in the future if you decide to move the entire library to another server. Clicking Advanced will give you a more detailed options view. You will notice an additional option called Library File. This is the before-mentioned config file for the library that holds all the information about the different transcoding templates. By default, it will be placed in the library root location in a hidden folder called .config with the file name -element.lib. You are free to choose any other location if you like. In the advanced view, you can set the library roots for the different operating systems. The next step is to define a database. Don't worry if you are not too familiar with databases. For a simple setup, you have the option to choose a file-based database. This will save the database in a single file. The SQLite database is good for testing purposes, or if you are creating a personal library locally on your own workstation. Please be aware that if you delete that file, all information will be lost. Also, the SQLite is not really designed to be used on a server as a shared database. It can be used, but there are a few issues. Please do some research on the internet before using it in a production environment. For teams, it is recommended to create a Postgres database. Ask your IT department to set up a Postgres server for you if one is not already existing at your facility. Again, the Advanced button will bring up more detailed options to define the location of the file-based SQLite database. For this tutorial, we go with the single file database. All that is left to do now is to click Create Library. To import an existing library, simply click Import Library. Navigate to the -element.lib file and select it.